Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Swislocki. I teach in the NYU Abu Dhabi History Program, and I welcome you here tonight on behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. Many accomplished historians have already spoken in this venue. Tonight inaugurates the efforts of the NYU Abu Dhabi History Program to introduce itself to you. My colleagues and I have chosen to do so by launching a lecture series titled Globalizing Histories. Tonight, we are very pleased to have with us Professor Barbara Metcalf, former president of the American Historical Association. In May, we will introduce to you our second speaker, Professor Jorge Flores of the European University Institute. May also brings a substantial conference, Globalizing Histories of Science, Technology, and Medicine, organized by Professors Lauren Minsky and Justin Stearns. I know you are here, like me, for Professor Metcalf's presentation. I would like to say just a few words about why she is such a perfect choice for us for this occasion. And so I'll also have to say just a little bit, about us. We in the NYU Abu Dhabi History Program are engaged in a kind of experiment. Our program differs from most other history programs you'll find around higher education. Most history programs around the world are organized around categories of nations, civilizations, or certain areas of study. Thus, we have US history, French history, Chinese history, Asian history, Latin American history, Western history, non-Western history. Our program is an experiment in trying something else. For now, we're working with a model of ocean systems, which we identify as 4 long-standing zones of human interaction and imagination: the Atlantic world, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean region, and the Asia-Pacific region. This ocean system model that we use for now should not be taken to mean that we only study oceanic activity, or that we're determined to replace one way of dividing up the world with yet another way of dividing up the world. The purpose of our model is simply to begin to explore what kind of new historical connections and processes might come into view by reconfiguring geography. We are engaged in what we might think of as a kind of ocular experiment. We're all uncertain about how well our ocean system model will work and what it will yield. We already expect that it will make better sense of some parts of the world than other parts of the world. And the model is the subject of ongoing assessment. Assessing the model and improving it, replacing it if need be, is part of what we're doing here. And we're in a position to conduct such an experiment because we're part of an institution that generously supports, if not demands, such innovation, and also because of the work of historians like Professor Metcalf. I could say that Professor Metcalf is an historian of such and such a place. Yet doing so would seem to run contrary to the spirit of our curriculum. Better then to resist identifying her field of history and instead to flag some of her main areas of contribution. Professor Metcalf seems to have started her career with a question about visibility, a very helpful question for our ocular experiment. It was a question about whom we see and where we see them when we study history. In one of her articles, she tells the following story. Early on, I was asked by a senior professor what I planned to specialize in, and I answered that I intended to work on Indian Muslims. His reply, no doubt intended for my welfare, was a splutter. Muslims. Why, they are no more than 5% of the population, and they simply do not matter. I remember the percentage because it was so wrong, but the point was not really the number. Fortunately, Professor Metcalf persevered. Her work has since very significantly interrogated the use of historical narratives to define the nature of India's peoples and draw the boundaries of citizenship, raising compelling questions about the extent to which one could posit, for example, a Hindu golden age, for which Muslims could only be foreign invaders, oppressors who ultimately ushered in a period of decline. Interrogated inherited frameworks and offering alternatives has been a major challenge and contribution of her career, much of which has illustrated the importance of Muslims to Indian history. In so doing, she has also drawn attention to the importance of Indian Muslims to Muslim history. And she has turned her attention also to the histories of Muslims in North America and Europe performing a similar task, highlighting the importance of Muslims to North American and European history, and of the importance of North American and European Muslims to Muslim history. She has shown us, in short, that relevant zones of human interaction and imagination are not so easy to find, not straightforward, and rarely, if ever, conform to received notions of who is part of a nation, who is seen as part of a religion, making her work in turn all the more crucial for understanding the nation and for understanding religion. Such points might seem obvious now, here. Getting here has not, I think, been easy. We are fortunate to be part of an institution that creates the kind of opportunities to build on such precedents and to be the beneficiaries of the work of scholars like Professor Metcalf, without whom it would not be possible, I think, for us to undertake the curricular experiment we're involved in today. Tonight, I believe Professor Metcalf continues her inquiry into visibility, speaking to us on the elusiveness of the Tablighi Jamaat. Please welcome Professor Barbara Metcalf.
I thank Mark very much for such an interesting introduction. I thank you all for being here, and my real appreciation to my historian colleagues and everyone for welcoming me to such an extraordinary place as this is. Delighted to be here. And my talk, in fact, is really about people who are not interested in any of these categories that we're all ourselves finding elusive and trying to grasp. So let me proceed directly to talk about Tablighi Jamaat. It's a movement, if I use that word, I'm even using that word tentatively, that although many of you may never have heard of, is by those who have heard of it often described as the largest Islamic movement in the world. The estimates vary very dramatically. 12 million participants, 80 million participants. Where is it? 165 countries was one estimate I saw. Persuading their fellow Muslims, wayward and nominal as virtually all of them are, to embrace ritual fidelity and align their everyday behavior with the model behavior of the Prophet Muhammad is the program that Tablighi Jamaat espouses. People often compare Tablighis to Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses, but it never works. They don't hand out pamphlets. The Americans among us, I'm sure, have had Jehovah's Witnesses. Maybe they come here to, I don't know, knock on the door. But that's not their style. They don't deal in the written word. They don't deal in discussion, in intellectual encounter, not debates. They want to teach by practice, by active learning, to pull people out of their routine obligations, the everyday cues you have to your habitual behavior, and then move out from what you normally do every day, ideally with other people, and in that new atmosphere, follow the rituals, the daily habits, the virtuous behavior they take as models. And that's the movement. Ideally, a male Tabligh participant spends one night a week, one weekend a month, 40 continuous days a year, 120 days at least once in their lives, even a full year, living with 10 or so colleagues, organized as a group, a Jamaat. And during that time, they live simply, sleep in a mosque, remember God's name, listen to teachings from the Quran and the Sunnah, which are the recorded traditions of prophetic behavior, and in every detail of their life, prayers, human interaction, modes of drinking water or entering a lavatory, act according to the model. And what they do is tabligh, inviting, preaching, informing nominal Muslims. And this picture is meant to be one of these people trying to persuade someone else, coming to a door, encountering someone in a street or a mosque. They go out locally, they go out in a group. The group ideally will mix old-timers and newcomers, the more experienced helping the less experienced to live the way they should. And they pay for the excursions themselves. So this is why movement may not be the right word. It is so grassroots. It is so particular in that sense. So here is a picture I found, someone preaching. On the website where I found it, there was a poem, which I just threw up a few verses of. I won't read all of it, but the gist of it is from an admirer. Ideally, a Tablighi himself would not claim this kind of change, saying that empty mosques were now full, that the Jamaats travel, it says, like rain-bearing clouds, bringing water to thirsty land. So that is the image, that there is a faithful remnant of people who have understood prophetic message correctly. And the heart of that message is the responsibility to do this kind of inviting, this kind of teaching, this kind of exemplifying, this kind of proselytizing. I have a short video, just a minute long.
Allah, ini Amir kami, Amir. Ya Allah. Ya Allah. Ya Allah. La haula wala. Allah. Akbar. Inilah Amir kami, namanya Yusuf. Subhanallah.
So that was it. A group walk. I wanted you to see the group of people walking. I think couldn't you feel that they were tired from the way they were repeating their invocation? You could hear God's name, I'm sure, whether you could understand anything else or not. They're probably outside their home territory. They were carrying bundles to spend the night. One was wearing a Pathan hat, an Afghan hat, so perhaps was an outsider. And what are they doing? There's a dog barking. They'll try to get by the dog. They'll come to a house. They'll knock on the door. A man will come to the door. And at that house, the next house they come to, they'll ask him to come with them to the mosque. They'll ask him, can you recite the kalama, the attestation of faith? Do you know how to repeat the prayer? This is what they do over and over and over again. And their goal will actually be to bring that person along with them. A word of history. The practice in this form began in colonial India in the 1920s on the part of Islamic scholars associated with a particular sectarian orientation, denomination, you might call it, of Sunni Islam in that part of the world, Deobandi. Deobandis had emerged as a distinctive reformist sect in the late 19th century, apolitical, training scholars to preserve the Islamic tradition as they saw it in a time of alien rule, in a time when they could not depend on princely patronage, but needed local support, needed to supply the education, the imamship, the leadership, the guardianship of shrines and so forth that people needed. So India, and this is the original center in New Delhi. People going in, if you go into this part of New Delhi, there will be people dressed like those you saw coming back from a trip, going out on a trip. One of the central features features of this movement I've described the tours, that's the heart, the grassroots heart. But there's another kind of institution, if you will, that is utterly central, and that is annual 3-day convocations that are held in a variety of countries. I seem to have started with one which is held in a major center for Western Europe. So in Dewsbury in UK, in that mosque you see at the end of the street, that's a place. Here is a large congregation in Malaysia. I have this reproduction of a sign which you would see probably all over for miles around when the convocation, it's called an ijtima, is about to be held in Pakistan. I've been in India in the lead up to one of these meetings, those same kind of paper signs all over the city. Here is a snap of people on their way to the most recent ijtima. The one in Bangladesh is extraordinary. A friend of mine who works on something totally different, made the mistake of landing in Dhaka airport at the time that this was going on, and found himself in a 12-hour traffic rush trying to get into the city. And you can see people there arriving at Tongi, where this is held. And I took this one from an Indonesian site. Tablighis now in this new media know what's going on in different places, excuse me. The Tablighi meetings, these ijtima, are often described as the largest gatherings of Muslims in the world outside the Hajj at Mecca. And so the estimate might be a couple of million people turning up for what are in Pakistan and Bangladesh for what are truly extraordinary events. I've talked mostly about men. Women do go out. They go when accompanied by their menfolk, but their primary responsibility is within their own circles, within their homes, within their neighborhoods, within their city, where they will try to encourage in the same way other women, where they will also meet for discussion and for education, really. And here is a group of Tablighi women in Bangladesh gathered for study. I might note that I was chewed out by one South African woman who was part of a group in Dewsbury when I visited there. I said something along the line, well, sort of tell me about how you came to do this. Your husband got involved, and she was so indignant because, in fact, she had been the one that had brought this practice, this style, to her family. One more point about Tablighis, a general point. They stand apart in what are often fiercely sectarian contexts. Shia Sunni, denominational among Sunnis. They ideally ignore challenges against them on the part of modernists, on the part of Islamists, a term I use for those who have an explicit political program. Muslims, and these are some of the criticisms of Tablighis. Muslim critics committed to social and political action, including militant jihad on the part of some Islamists and others, condemn them for their interpretation of the Islamic message as centered on Tabligh. They feel that they are irresponsible in that sense. They are irresponsible in another sense, critics would say, in that they go off and leave their families, leave their home responsibilities. Or critics may couch their complaints in terms of anti-intellectualism. All Tablighis do is repeat the same thing. And these may be the limits, but they may engage in a kind of specifically Islamic form of argumentation, which may be sufficient in itself or may also be part of a complaint about their emphasis, and that would be that they build their models on weak hadith, that their insistence that they have understood the prophetic message to call for this kind of behavior, apolitical, ritual-focused, self-fashioning, as I call it, this kind of emphasis on becoming, on embodying the hadith, that this whole notion and the kind of aura they give to it is a misinterpretation based on not understanding Hadith scholarship. Still, I mean, for all these criticisms, the Tabligh message seems straightforward enough. Why then did I call it elusive? And I have two answers to that question, and let me deal with the first one first. First starts. I mean, I guess I should begin by saying it's elusive because some of the things I said already, right? How can you talk about a movement that's either 12 million or 80 million? There are those kinds of uncertainties. But the other form of elusiveness is the question of whether or not this is a movement that one ought to be suspicious of, that one ought to fear, that one ought to associate with, the charged word associated with Islam in our time of terrorism. And I think that the suspicion of Tablighi Jamaat is one, and the controversy over whether it is, in fact, an even dangerous movement is a somewhat, or it seems to be a somewhat elusive question. What could be more suspicious, say in an airplane queue, than travelers dressed like this? So critics in the worlds of policy and journalism especially have disputed really the kind of description I've given you and the basic claim that this is an apolitical movement. Some take a softer line, arguing that the movement may not be terrorist in itself, but that it prepares people to join extremist organizations by raising their identity as Muslims. Or they will argue that the movement is a cover used by at least some participants to further terrorist aims. Since the attacks on the World Trade Center, there has been regular commentary of this sort, that Tablighi Jamaat is an antechamber of terrorism, of militant fundamentalism. One article along these lines has a title that says it all: Tablighi Jamaat, Jihad's Stealthy Legions. The researcher, Alex Alexiev, tags the Tablighis as wolves in sheep clothing. Because they are linked to the Deobandi denomination, this particular sectarian group, that in itself causes alarm for some people, in part because the Taliban have taken that, come out of that tradition as well. So this particular author argues that their creed is hardly distinguishable from the radical Wahhabi, Salafi, jihadist ideology that so many terrorists share. This is an argument that is actually widely held, but against the work of most academics who have worked on the subject. In a sense, though, the fact that academics may insist that this is an incorrect representation of the movement becomes irrelevant when you have a situation like Guantanamo, when many of the prisoners held there were held in part on the ground, at least in part, on the grounds that they had had association with Tablighi Jamaat. And if in the years since 9/11 you were a close reader of news articles on terrorism, that might well be where you would have encountered references to Tablighi Jamaat. And so I actually will flip through familiar faces if you followed this news. All of these are cases where the people involved were described as having had engagement with Tablighi Jamaat. Leave it on that last one. I didn't picture the bombers who planned were planning to take, remember this, liquid onto airplanes and mix them, as a result of which all of us have limitations on how much shampoo we can carry. They were associated with Tablighi Jamaat. There was a roundup in Barcelona just a couple of years ago of a dozen people, again, all of whom had Tablighi connections. So in a sense, following stories like these, this seems to be grounds for arguing that this is a movement that radicalizes people and may, in fact, be more than that. Nonetheless, I want to insist that there is no prima facie reason to assume that contact with or active participation should be on its own cause for suspicion. For myself, who works on South Asia, one reason is obvious. I have felt at many points that I have never met a Pakistani or an Indian Muslim who had not had some contact with Tablighis. Somebody in their family has gone out. When they were students, the Tablighis were always knocking at their door. They know the mosque where Tablighis meet. It is such an omnipresent form of behavior that in itself seems to me one reason. I added here that may not mean they like them. The late Pakistani journalist Khalid Hassan liked to tell the story of a friend who, if a Tablighi came to his door and knocked and said, "Please recite the attestation of faith," he would answer, "Why? Has it changed?" So there's a certain, there are certainly people who are very distant from this movement, not for these serious political reasons or anything else. But there is that kind of attitude, and nonetheless, it brings me back to even this person who is somewhat detached in his appreciation of what they're doing would have had encounters. Many of the fears of Tablighis, I think, reflect widespread stereotypes about Muslims that are worth clarifying, because if we clarify them in relation to Tablighis, we clarify them generally. First, it is all too common to suspect all Muslim activists of any kind, as potential jihadis. Looking at dress, looking at beards in Europe or America may in itself raise anxiety. A simple equation of something like the Deobandi denomination with terrorism, I think, is another pitfall. If you think in terms of any religious tradition, the shape it takes in different contexts, different locations over time is likely to be dramatically different. Those are the kinds of reasons I would cite. One might add that the recently deceased Grand Mufti of Wahhabi Saudi Arabia classed the Jamaat as deviant and condemned them on sectarian grounds for deviations, which hardly makes them sound like the Wahhabi, Salafi, Deobandi equation that too often commentators resort to. An important takeaway point is simply this: all Islamic activists are not the same. Even all, to return to the point I just made, Deobandis are not the same. And if you look at this specific denomination today, in India, in Pakistan, in Kashmir, in Bangladesh, in Afghanistan, you will find in each place people who call themselves Deobandi assimilating to the political culture of those dramatically divergent areas. In India, the Deobandis act as an education, social welfare group trying to negotiate the democratic political scene to deal with politicians who support them. In Pakistan, there are Deobandis who are active jihadis, and there, unlike in India, the Deobandis are a political party. The leading ulama are a political party. And as I've already mentioned, the Afghan Taliban took their origin from Deobandi madrasas. A second problem, of course, is that Tablighi Jamaat is not a unified organization, and that's where the analogies to, say, Mormons really fail. There are no clear boundaries of who's inside or outside. Anyone can go on a mission or join a lesson circle or seek out blessings at the annual meeting. And who is there to give orders without a clear hierarchy? There are elders, but part of what makes the movement so effective is the role it accords ordinary lay people. And finally, one of the reasons that the movement as such has to be recognized as, in fact, apolitical in the sense I'm describing it, is that in order to accomplish what they want to do, they are urgently in need of official support. It's that simple. Now, perhaps you could go out, as that Indonesian villager was doing, but if you want to organize a meeting of tens, hundreds, or even more, thousands of people, you can't do it without official support. And I took this, you saw this picture before, of people on their way to a meeting in India, and I just cut and pasted part of the news article that described part of all of the people that they felt they had to thank for help in organizing this meeting. Their whole modus operandi depends on good relations with officialdom. You need visas, you need permits, you need infrastructure, and where you need extra cars on the train, and you need water supply, and so forth. And this is particularly interesting because this ijtima was taking place in a state, Madhya Pradesh, which is dominated by the Hindu right-wing party, notoriously anti-Muslim, but they will still accommodate an organization like this. And similarly, the people involved with it need to work with those officials out of mutual interest. Having said all that, the permeability of participation, the range of settings, means that there are obviously going to be people, individuals who hold political opinions, political inclinations. Even if there's a firm expectation, and clearly part of the success of the movement, that politics has no place when they are engaged in Tabligh work, and Tabligh work should be their overriding responsibility. There are inevitably people who don't hold to that stance. And so in that sense, I think the word elusive may still be right. Knowing what is going on in the lives of everyone in Tabligh circles is elusive. But the bottom line is clear. For the organization as such, and for committed participants, politics are just not important. But the other side, the second side of elusiveness, and maybe more, and I think, in fact, a more important elusive quest for us, is to try to figure out why this movement in our modern, globalized world has the extraordinary appeal that it does. One source for that are the accounts rendered upon a mission's return. Back at their starting place, travelers provide an account, sometimes oral, sometimes written. They're not officially preserved in any archive. Some have made their way into print, very controversially, since elders have urged against the practice. Some make their way onto internet blogs and forums. In reading accounts, I have been struck by two discourses. And by discourse, I mean the framing, the terms invoked, the structure that is given to the story of what happened. That frame gives the events their meaning, and in fact, to those who hear the account, imbues it with truth. And so the way the story is told convinces people who hear it, I'm proposing, that this particular interpretation of what Muslims should be doing, of how Muslims should be acting, of what it is they should be paying attention to, devoting their lives to, is the true one, is the right one. And the first discourse is that of Sufism. The lives of Sufis, as we kind of classically think of them, are devoted to disciplines, to meditation, to moral purification. There are institutions associated with Sufism, above all, chains of succession that pass on powerful charisma as one elder initiates each successor, each disciple. In South Asian accounts, at least, and now I'm talking about the Tablighi accounts, the spiritual state and charisma which comes to an individual is now to be gained by participation in the charismatic community of the Jamaat. As it does for the Sufi adept, the Tablighi gains through his experiential states in this life the assurance that what he is doing is receiving divine blessing. And that may be described by miraculous interventions of every kind. It may be that when they go out, we were talking about this earlier, they have left behind sick family members, and the neighbors will say, "How can you go on a Jamaat?" And when the person comes back, the child is healed. Okay? It may be divine intervention because you're in a state of despair, and it's at that moment that the knock comes on the door, and the Tablighi says, "Come with me," and you go, and you turn your life around. Okay? These are the kinds of miraculous interventions, and they're also described in these experiential states. There's a book-length account of a Jamaat from the western state of Maharashtra, which is incredible. It's in the 1980s, and it's a Jamaat that goes to China. Now, it's not that easy to find Muslims in a lot of China, and it's especially not that easy if you don't speak Chinese, not a person did. So it's an extraordinary account. But the author, in writing this account of what happens, uses terms like lutf, grace, and kef, exhilaration, and sukun-e-qalb, peace of heart, to describe the spiritual experience that made them know they were doing the right thing. There's another account from 1950 to the troubled area of the Punjab after partition, period of terrible violence, spoke of and as they described their experience, they talked about being granted the light of insight, nur-e basirat, and gnosis, ma'arifat, and revelations, inkishaf, accorded those who participated. Other anecdotes illustrate how a Jamaat becomes a vehicle for what are essentially the karamat, or miracles, gained in classic Sufi accounts. There's one of the early, and the format is like the Sufi hikayat, they're often called. So there's a Jamaat going to America, and there's a terrible storm, and the Tablighis on board pray, and the captain, who has been annoyed by them all the way through, as the storm ends, realizes he was wrong and realizes it's the power of their spirituality, if I can use that word, that has brought God's grace to calm the seas. Okay, so you can imagine a Sufi story where there's a skeptic, an intervention, a miracle, and this is with the Jamaat acting. The emphasis on repeating God's name, the zikr is a familiar Sufi practice, and the 3-day ijtima, one might suggest, offers an analog to the 3-day annual festival at saints' tombs, a practice Tablighis avoid, and particularly the final prayer of the dua, which is offered by one of the revered leaders. It's a prayer, a spontaneous prayer that may go on for half an hour. And this is one that those who experience it, as he calls down God's blessing on their work, as he prays for the well-being of Muslims and the world and so forth, in which people express this kind of almost transcendent experience that will come to them in this huge kind of crowd that we have seen pictured in this slide, with people sobbing and crying during these concluding prayers, praying for the forgiveness of God for their shortcomings and for God's grace in what they're doing. One Bangladeshi scholar, in fact, has argued that this represents a new kind of pilgrimage, a ziyarat is the word used for pilgrimage in South Asia, essentially a substitute for pilgrimage to saints' tombs. The second recurrent discourse is the essentially military vocabulary of jihad. Following prophetic hadith, Muslims distinguish outright warfare in a legitimate cause as the lesser jihad, struggle and effort to subdue the base instincts and emotions of the self as the greater jihad. The shared idiom of jihad actually gives organizational shape to the Jamaat, which, like a political undertaking, is led by an emir. Actions are guided by shura, by consultation, as an emir might do, except that this is a very democratic consultation. Outings are called gasht, patrols, and khuruj, sorties. Anyone who dies during a tabligh tour is lucky enough, as one 60s letter puts it, to be a shaheed, just like a martyr in battle. Tablighi work, like that of an armed mujahid, is understood to be fi sabilillah, in the path of God. And as in the lesser jihad, the militant jihad, right? The participant will receive exponentially increased reward for every act performed in the course of tabligh, so that the canonical prayer during a tour merits the equivalent of 200,000 prayers of one at home. A rupee, $1 spent in the work of jihad, is worth 1 million, and so forth. In both forms, the believer is enjoined to effective action in a world that needs to be changed. And in a very interesting interpretation, which in fact parallels Islamist thought in relation to the lesser jihad, the greater jihad, in the sense the Tablighis define it, is now an individual obligation, farz al-ain, no longer a farz al-kifayat, no longer a collective obligation to be formed by a few for the sake of all. This is a very important, if you will, theological distinction. So preaching, teaching is no longer the work of the learned alone, but of every single individual Muslim. Just as Islamists would argue that jihad no longer has to follow the kind of classical interpretation where it's conducted by emir and so on and so forth. It has to take place from an area of Muslim majority, the whole set of laws. Like the Islamists, Tabligh elders have argued that however many Muslims there may be in the world in name, almost none is properly Muslim. It is up to this faithful few, like the lonely Muslims of Mecca, to achieve a veritable revolution. And so again, parallel to the Islamists, the Tablighis describe our current world as a world of jahiliyyah, a word historically associated with Arabia before prophetic revelation. So we can begin to see the appeal. A participant engages in effective action in the world. And Tablighis have that satisfaction, no matter whether the targeted audience changes or not. Change is not in their control. They fulfill an absolute obligation by offering, by inviting, by preaching. And in doing that, are acting in accord with what will be judged, what is at stake at the day of judgment. And of course, in every act, they accrue ever more merit as they go along. It's a very interesting pedagogical approach that you change yourself by doing, that you cannot learn how to be a Muslim by simply reading about it. And so not only are you trying to change other people, but with every moment you're changing yourself. So the work offers the participants the sense of self-worth, self-respect, that comes with the knowledge that the participant, enjoined to humility to be sure, stands apart, knows something others don't know. And let me underline what I would take to be a quartet of satisfactions that, in a sense, are worldly satisfactions, ones I think it's easy for us to understand that come with this work. First, in a world where dignity and self-respect is threatened at every turn, in hierarchic societies, in poor societies, in racially divided societies, which all of ours are, I guess. The Tablighi practices provide a rare space of equality. Social distinctions are meant to disappear in the course of Tabligh work. Here are words from a dhobi, a Bengali laundryman. I am a poor dhobi. After joining Tablighi Jamaat, many of the local people started to honor me, to speak with me politely. I go to dawah and ijtima with other respectable people, engineers, doctors, first-class government service holders who respect me and value my opinion. On a tour, the socially humble may be assigned as the spokesman. The uneducated person only has to be able to say, "Come with us to the mosque," or "Can I teach you how to say the prayer?" So the humble, uneducated person may be the teacher. The most elite may wind up doing the cooking and cleanup for this group that's traveling together. Secondly, a Tablighi lifestyle, if we can call it that, solves the problem of life in a consumer society where who you are is what you wear and what you own. In a world where the often unattainable pull of consumerism is all too obvious, an orientation to Tablighi Jamaat offers an emphatically counterculture celebration of simple living, withdrawal from mass entertainment and media, no televisions, modest and unadorned clothing, and so forth. In Tablighi tradition, the Prophet Muhammad is a pious ascetic whose love of God overwhelms all his other material concerns. There's many stories. You can look at Muhammad's life and emphasize different parts of it. This is the part they take as the core. He slept on a simple mat. He rejected offers of gold. He owned nothing save the cloth on his back, despite his greatness as the prophet of mankind. And so the choice to identify with a non-consumer lifestyle. I've missed some pictures, but you'll catch up. I like a few of these photographs. Here is a woman who has adopted what she takes to be appropriate dress, but we're reminded that perhaps her mother or perhaps herself in an earlier age dressed in a different way. Here is somebody coming back from a 40-day tour, and by looking at the drawing behind him, we can remember that we're reminded that there are many ways of dressing and living and spending your time, and he's chosen one. So the ad on the wall is the message on this picture. Third, there is a great deal in the Tablighi program that speaks to the needs, even anxieties, of a mobile world of global change. Tablighis are on the move in a moving world. In any new setting, they find people who dress and act like them. A Tablighi carries a portable religion, characterized by ritual and not dependent, for example, on hereditary spiritual guides or the fixed site and calendar of a charismatic holy man's shrine. And finally, Tablighi apoliticism, controversial as it is among Muslims, is virtually a limiting case of the de facto secularism of traditionalist Islam. A limiting case, and actually as I was putting these comments together, I was thinking about something written a long time ago, and that was by a man, a Canadian called Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who wrote in the mid-20th century. And looking at Indian Muslims, he said, are Indian Muslims, in a sense, modeling ways of living in a religiously plural world, which is increasing the world every religious tradition lives in, because they already live in a mixed society? It's an interesting question, I think. And there are people who argue, and I call this a limiting case, an extreme case of a kind of de facto separation, if you will, of religion and politics. And it does come out of India. So it's just something to kind of think about. You know, if you take the position, which some people do, that despite all of the attention today highlighted by the drama of places like Mali and Somalia and extreme punishments and Islamist programs and the Muslim Brotherhood, for all of that drama, in the long term, these kinds of historical traditions of politics having in many ways its own logic apart from Islamic teachings. If this limiting case may be an important one. So arguably, hard as it may be to see, this focus on personal salvation may well be the future of Islamic movements in our integrated plural world. And whether it is or not, for the moment, it serves Tablighis well as a way of practicing their faith in a way that works in a wide variety of contexts. So having stressed all this kind of relevance, here's a last word, perhaps more true to what the Tablighi experience might add up to. And I take this from a Southeast Asian scholar, Farish Noor, who has done extensive ethnography of Tablighi Jamaat in his part of the world. And it brings our discussion back full circle to ways of imagining the world. We're trying to imagine it here as academics, but how is the world imagined by Tablighis? And one can say that theirs is in many ways a parallel world that has its own temporal logic, its own spatial logic. It rewrites history so that the academic history of Jahiliyyah becomes the reality of today, for example. In an age of capital-driven globalization, there remain, and here I'm quoting Farish Noor, other forms of globalization at work, largely, that may intend to take humanity in a different destination altogether. And I think we do well to understand both the spiritual core on the one hand and the modernity and relevance of a movement like this, something very easy to miss if all we look for is terrorism.
I was wondering, because it seems that this is a very Tablighi Jamaat. It looks like a very grassroots movement, and usually in the movement there is a leader or the authority that the followers of the movement kind of rely upon. For example, it seems to me that when it first occurred in the 1920s India, it might have occurred a lot of criticism from the Islamic elites or privileged judges, because it seems that it gives more power to the unlearned and to kind of lower class of a society. It gives more authority to them. And so I was thinking maybe in the beginning that it might have there might have been criticism, or there might have been oppressions from so I was wondering, where would these followers of the Jamaat movement or Tablighi movement find authority, who, I mean, on what grounds they believe that the unlearned or the uneducated can also find the meanings or gain salvation through going to the doors to other Muslims and requiring them or asking them to recite the poem, or offering them to how to pray, yeah.
I think you've asked a couple of extremely interesting questions. The first question, if I've got this right, one part of the question is movements have leaders. They have some kind of a major leader. And what is interesting is that the movement, in some very basic ways, has, on the one hand, routinely expressed admiration for the learned. That is one of the things that, you know, when you come, say, to this final prayer at the Ijtima, it may be somebody who is known for his learning. It may also be someone who is associated with the kind of descent we get in a Sufi chain, whose father and grandfather were all highly honored. So they might have that family charisma, so they are absolutely respected. On the other hand, in a way that does not contradict the new empowerment given to ordinary people, because I think those who are sympathetic to the movement recognize this as a way of building the Muslim community. And there is no question but that that is a major goal, the well-being of Muslims in the world. I would also add that this kind of laicization, if you want to call it that, has been characteristic of Islamic movements that began in the 20th century generally. And so the kind of leading figures in the political movements, the Islamist movements, are similarly, historically, not people who came out of the great madrasas. They're not people who had the classic Arabic learning for the most part, but rather people who were professionally educated, people who were whatever, doctors, accountants, engineers, and so forth. And so there has been a move, a kind of parallel move there too. That doesn't mean that there are not people who criticize the Tablighis exactly for the reason that you give. How can this Dhobi, this washerman, be out there telling people what to do? And yet it seems to be effective. And because of that, it makes it possible to build in this kind of chain reaction where one person grabs another. Does that answer your question?
I'd like to thank you very much for your very precious lecture and knowledgeable. I've been living, my brother is one of the Tablighis. He lives for fi sabilillah for the past 40 years or so.
Where?
He's in France. He's an emir in France. And he's always between Pakistan, Rawand. They just came back from Bangladesh in January. They had the 3-day meeting and all that. And he's been living like that for the past 40 years. He's got 5 kids. He was married there. I mean, he and his wife, they went into yoga, and then they discovered, they met the Tablighis in India, and they left everything and went into Islam immediately. She became fully veiled, and they lived the Islamic way since the early 70s. But I have a lot of criticism for him. I mean, if you generalize it for all the world, who would work? My brother has his PhD in finance, but he never worked. He lives fi sabilillah, and God gives him, and they're living in France. They're under the social security of France. But if everybody was like that, where is the productivity? It will be nil. And then another criticism I have, I believe, I'm a good Muslim myself, alhamdulillah. I do my prayers, I do my duties and everything. But I believe our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was much more progressive than the way they want to depict him. You know, they put the henna, the beard, the dresses, the length of the thobe, the length of the, it's exactly like Sayyidina Rasul. But I believe if Sayyidina Rasul was living these days, he would wear much more practical clothes. He would be living a more practical life rather than the 1500 years ago. I mean, they're too static. It's not, Islam is much deeper than this. It's not only these, the way they walk and the way they, okay, prayer is a must, everything is a must, but there must be something more to that. I mean, okay, it's fine. They're very happy. You can see him and his friends and everybody, they're really so happy. But you cannot generalize it for the whole world. It wouldn't work.
It's very interesting.
I don't know if you got my point.
No, I think we all are very grateful for this firsthand description, which is fabulously interesting. And you have put your finger on kind of a range of absolutely key issues, of which I especially like your last one, about how happy he is. And I mean, you now are with anthropologists who have done ethnographic work, who have made exactly that comment. They're so happy. How come? So it's an elusive movement. I'll stay with that word. I think, again, you have articulated in a very, evocative way the dilemma of work. And there is a range, by the way. I mean, there certainly are people who keep up, many people who keep up their livelihood. I mean, I know university professors who are deeply involved in the movement. It's a cushy life. It's not 9 to 5. You get holidays when you're a university professor, and manages to do this around the edges. There are the Tablighi Jamaat has been very, very big in some of the Pakistani military wings, big in the Air Force. It will often be this kind of chain where one officer or one group gets connected, and soon there's a whole cluster. So that question of work, I do think varies a lot, and but yours is absolutely a kind of classic concern that people understandably have. And second, just to say, and your second point, I think, again, is very important for us, especially those of us who aren't Muslim, to see the way, if you will, the symbol of the Prophet's life is open to multiple interpretations. And yours is one that is obviously, for many people, the only one that makes sense in the world we live in today. But here are people who are opting for a different explanation. So thank you for your comments.
I know very little about Islam, but the very little I know says that there is only one God, there is only one prophet, there is only one book. Is that correct? It seems to me a little pretentious to try to be little prophets. Little prophets, to do something that there is only one prophet. And it seems to me like going out and trying to be another prophet is not really very Islamic.
Well, okay, I mean, I don't think they see themselves as prophets. They see themselves as teachers, as disseminating the message of the prophet. Yeah, as they understand it.
My question is, when you feel you are concerned about the transformation of this movement from the political orientation which it has, but doesn't have the commitment which you mentioned, as far as I understood in political terms, but they change and they transform into some terrorist activities. And when do you think the authorities should be more worried and concerned, and they should stop at the bud the movement from turning out into a more politicized, more violently akin movement? I say this because you mentioned a number of case studies, like in Somalia and in Mali. Where do we place those people when we are talking about Mali? We find Al-Qaeda, we find the Tawariq, we find other groups of people. So how do they really manage to spread their message when there are other groups who have more radicalized message in that atmosphere?
I wasn't able to get all of what you asked, but I think I picked up a couple of things that you said.
So they are revivalist movement like the Sheikh Muhammad Abdu or Jamal Afghani or other people, or are they more radical, attuned towards more radicalized forms of action in the end? I mean, what their objective is in the end is not just satisfaction of their own spiritual.
I think the primary goal is, I think it is in some ways a profoundly individualist movement in which they are seeking their own salvation by serving the Ummah. And they see these as perfectly fitting together in this non-political way. I think I'm sorry, I couldn't hear everything you said, but your last point, again, I think is extremely important. And that is that they are operating in a world everywhere of multiple competing movements, many of the others also transnational. There are other sectarian movements like them that are out doing very similar activities. There are the political movements. These are options, and people are choosing one or the other. And I've tried to say a little bit about what I think is so satisfying and why it seems to work so well for people from very diverse backgrounds, the examples we had here, and the washermen, that it seems to serve them all.
Firstly, thank you for the lecture. It's very interesting. I'm from a small town in the UK, and if I'm perfectly honest, I'd never heard of the Tablighi movement, so thank you. It's very informative for me.
Got to get to Dewsbury.
But I guess that is the basis of my question. I can see why certain scholars say it will arouse suspicion, because no one I know and in my community has ever heard of this, or to my knowledge. Is that the intended agenda, and do you think just general, more cohesive social integration can dispel that suspicion, or do you just think it's totally innocent and it's just a way of life? So I guess my question is it just a very social, a societal concern to just improve integration, or do you think there is some kind of other agenda where they just want to keep this very sort of elusive movement?
I'll just say a couple of things. One is, one of the interesting things about the Tablighi Jamaat, although the point is absolutely true, this is an outsider's label, is that they do not seek publicity. And they feel that is irrelevant to their work and risks it, because it is so important for this to be successful, that within the movement there not be controversy, that they not engage in debate. There was something else you said that I wanted to pick up on. And one of the major criticisms of the movement is that they are too inward-looking, that look at the Gulen movement, for example, which is a transnational movement that comes out of Turkey, that has schools all over Europe, that is very much geared to, what is it called? Sort of ecumenical religious understanding of getting on the same platform, Jews, Muslims, Christians, things like that. That would be a criticism, that they are not concerned with that kind of thing. Here is a picture it's because I look for it. I would answer you as somebody from the UK. The newspapers have been full, and that's only because that's what I see. The British papers of this proposed so-called mega mosque, which in South London, the Tablighis have been trying to build as a major center, and keeps getting set back by the zoning and planning commission and so forth, and partly because people are afraid, I think, of Muslims. It's that simple. And there could be a parking problem as well. So, those kinds of issues.
Thank you for this very enjoyable lecture. I think I enjoyed it the most because I have some experience with these people. You mentioned a lot of good facts about this. You call it movement, but they call it effort of deen.
Yes.
And many positive things about what they do. But I lost you in the middle, where there's an implied something about maybe it may become violent, or some kind of move away from the peaceful. Mm-hmm. I lost you there, because all of what you said and all what's known is that it's a peaceful, like you mentioned many times, they work on improving their own selves and the world around them. So how could that change all of a sudden to something radical? There is no, and also the pictures you showed that these people have a link with this movement. There is no basis for that, actually. So when I hear your lecture, I hear a lot of positive things, good things, but I got mixed signals with no basis for that.
Okay, let me just say, partly, I wanted to, it's interesting to me. I think one of the reasons I wanted to introduce that is to kind of set the record right, because there has been so much in the report of terrorism that links Tablighi Jamaat with it. And it is, I think, probably quite accurate that in those pictures I flashed up, probably all of those people have had, I know they have. I know they have. I know I've interacted with the so-called Portland Six, African-American Jehovah's Witnesses who through Tablighi Jamaat turned their lives around. This is another kind of theme that the Tablighis talk about. The drunks, the people who are living in chaos in their lives for whom this provides order, the women whose husbands stop beating them now that they go out on Tablighi Jamaat. There are a lot of those kinds of stories. So, you know, I have actually sat in the same prison cell talking to a woman, the one woman in that group of six, about what Tablighi Jamaat meant in her, the role it played in her life. Well, I don't believe she was guilty of anything. That's my own opinion. But, you know, that's kind of not where, I really don't want to go in that direction to talk about guilt or lack of guilt. But that she was involved in Tablighi Jamaat, absolutely. Ditto with the other West Coast case, John Walker Lind. No question about it. He's a mixed up intellectual, a mixed up adolescent, trying everything you can try in California to get his life put together. And he links up with Tablighis. And, you know, what the Tablighis offer is one-on-one. You know, this whole question of where the authority comes from, in part it's because it is not from some remote figure, it's one-on-one. So there are absolutely connections. That's the first point. What I'm saying is, I don't think we can leap to that as an explanation for terrorism. On the other hand, I don't have the evidence, but many people think that it is used as a cover. Now, as one academic writing on this said, yeah, well, you could also use tours on cruise lines as a cover. It's almost that vague an accusation. You disguise yourself as Tablighis to get visas somewhere and you have nefarious projects. Of course you could do it. You could also disguise yourself as tourists. So that's kind of an extreme example. So I'm sorry if I was confusing. I'm certainly saying that the project in no way is linked to terrorism.
Well, a couple of comments were made. First of all, one of the gentlemen mentioned Tawariq versus Al-Qaeda, and well, Tawariq is an ethnic group. It's not it's a political issue. So now, I agree. This movement, and I followed this movement for a long time in the US and in Jordan and other places around the world. We can judge any organization, any movement by its writings, by its acts of its leaders and its people. Now, whether someone will get on tangent, that's not the problem of the movement, that's the problem of the individual. So again, we need to be really careful about stigmatizing a movement that may be a cover-up for something else. Now, you contrasted this movement, or Tablighi Jamaat, with what you called Islamists.
Yes.
And you said maybe the future would be for Islam and Muslims would be for Tablighi. Well, to me, it does not contradict being a good person and a good Muslim follower and following the Prophet, however you want to follow it from. Again, there is a huge bound within Islam to follow, and being at the same time a political person. So that does not put me in the Islamist area, because it seems, at least my observation, or from reading into or between the lines of what you said, it's either this movement or the other side of it is being an Islamist, and there is a contrast between the two. To me, and you mentioned actually the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, and you mentioned the Mali and that kind of thing. I think it is unfair to start comparing and contrasting this way, because there are people who opt to be political regardless of their background and their religion, whether they are Muslims or Christians or Jews. So why, when Muslims opt to become really active in politics and they win free elections, then we start stigmatizing? I'm not suggesting that you are stigmatizing them. Then the whole world stands up and starts saying, well, these are the Islamists, and it's a scary thing. Well, fair and square, in 4 years, if you don't like them, bring them down.
Well, I agree with you completely, and I don't want to, this was a quick comparison, but what I'm really trying to say in this, in some ways, let me try to say something a little different. I use Islamist in an extremely restricted definition, which many people, some people do. I think there's sort of an academic trend to restrict it very, very precisely to those movements really that have only 3 points of origin in the 20th century. One is, in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hasn al-Banna. One is the Maududi and the Jamaat Islami out of the Indian subcontinent. The third is the Iranian Revolution, the one successful one. And these all were, at least ideologically, movements that were committed to Islamizing all of the institutions of society. It's a very modern, very radical break with the historic tradition of Muslim societies, those Islamist positions. Now, what happens to these movements is I only alluded to this briefly, but you look at any of them, whether they come into power or not, they change, when in the little experience we have of them coming into power, they transform themselves in a wide variety of ways. So, in a sense, I'm not sure I'm saying this very well, but the contrast I was trying to draw was between some form of essentially living in a world that accepts what we roughly call a secular society, where there are religious people, but that the institutions of the state, for the most part, informed by the values of their people, follow their own logic. That is my one model. And that, I'm saying, Tablighis in a remote sense could be a limiting case for that kind of approach. And the other is this very specific attempt to move into this nizam, the notion of an Islamic order that fills all parts of society. That was the contrast I was trying to draw. Not politics generally.
I've interacted with the movement, although I'm not part of it, in the UK, in Yemen, to some extent here in the UAE. And I've known people who themselves have been part of it and who've spent time with them. I think it's important, I mean, speaking from a Muslim perspective, the movement for many Muslims who may have recommitted to their faith or even converted to Islam, the movement for them provided a very depoliticized, non-agenda based environment, which allowed them to kind of nurture, that initial, connection to the religion, which drove them to their commitment and to their devotion to the religion. And so for that reason, I think it fulfills a particular role amongst Muslims. I mean, myself, I'm not part of the movement, but I can see, in a Muslim community, how they can actually benefit, the more spiritual aspect of a Muslim community. Although, of course, there are many criticisms, like you mentioned, but I think at the same time, it's important to remember that they were established for a particular purpose. And I mean, that purpose was obviously to remind people about faith and to call people back to faith. And I think it wouldn't be fair to cast criticisms at them for why they're not doing other things, because they've not explicitly stated that, you know, their agenda is anything else. And I think the reason for what they were set up with, they're doing it. I mean, I have many criticisms about of the Tabligh, but at the same time, you know, when I was in Yemen, for example, and I saw the very Sufi-oriented, you know, aspect of the Tabligh, which was very different to the interpretation that they follow in India or Pakistan. I saw them interact with people and a knowledge tradition in Yemen that takes a more holistic outlook on the religion, while at the same time it incorporates some of the understandings of the Tabligh, but it has a more holistic understanding of the religion. So they will have, you know, aspects that they will have like an interpretation or understanding of the religion and a practice of the religion which extends beyond just mere, you know, calling people back to faith and so on. So, I mean, they were just two points that I felt.
It's an interesting comment, and I want to pick up on one point you make, and that is that although Tablighis imagine themselves as living in a space beyond national borders and being equally at home, you know, in Alaska or China, there certainly are regional differences, and I think that variety is very important, and also suggestive, along with this amorphous grassroots organization, suggestive of why the movement, if we want to call it that, has not had splits. You know, it's very unusual, the factionalizing that often takes place, that because it has this kind of openness, and also toward people participating in whatever way and whatever level they can, it's part of, I think, the secret of what makes them, or has made them, as effective and as pervasive as they've been. So thank you for those comments. If I can just say one last word, I realize as I stand here, I have talked about Tablighi Jamaat, but I've never given a lecture about Tablighi Jamaat, for example, in India or Pakistan, where I spend most of my time, and I've never talked to an audience with this much firsthand experience. So I want to thank you, firsthand experience or not. I thank you all for being here, but it has been especially interesting for me to hear these very informed comments from so many of you. So thank you.